In Warhammer 40k, there is the God Emperor of Mankind, who is the all-powerful being within the 40k world, and at this time is currently sealed in the Golden Throne. That means that his will is being interpreted by a select few. These men and people are able to channel the will of the Emperor through the masses, or essentially the military, in order to spread the will, the wants of mankind and the human race for, naturally, our own benefit. So, what if we actually tried to parallel that to more modern day? Well, you might find yourself exactly where we are here, which is where we've got a Vigilant Squad from the Imperial Agents box set, or Combat Patrol, and we're going to be painting up like the Swiss Guard, which is the Vatican's army. Yes, the Pope does have an army, and with that said, let's jump into the painting. We're going to be kicking off the paint job nice and simple, starting with the armour. This is because these are going to be some of the brightest areas, and we're going to need to compare it with certain other areas once we're done. So having these elements painted means that we've got a good comparison point later on, and we're going to be opting to paint all of these areas of armour in a nice dark purple base coat. The reason we're coming in and doing purple for the base coat on our armour is quite simple. We're going to be doing a slight adaptation on the Swiss Guard scheme. The Swiss Guard are naturally a red undersuit with layers of fabric of different colours over the top, mainly yellows, blues and things like that. Whereas what we're going to be doing is just doing a split colour scheme between red and blue on the armour. Naturally, the mix of these two is purple, which means that we can have a nice harmonious base point to start from as we then split out and pursue the red highlights and blue highlights. We want to kick off the split scheme starting with the blues, taking a rich ultramarine blue. What we can do is start to mix this into our purple, bringing the colour up to more of a dark violet tone. This can then be used across any of the sections of armour that we want to be blue in the end. Regardless of what panels that we're choosing to paint, we want to make sure that those panels get nearly an entirely new base coat in this colour, essentially just leaving the purple base coat in the deepest of recesses. We then want to follow this up by mixing another chunk of blue into the mix and then use this as a relatively broad highlight. This is going to be catching all the upper facing flat panels, while some of the deeper areas like the crotch and arms may get a more selective coat, building up highlights on the edges, going and following the previous initial blue mix and then brightening it up as we go. You may have noticed the way we're building up the colours on the armour, and how we're doing this is actually alternating one between the other. So we're not just going for a split scheme down the middle or split across just the panels. Essentially what we're doing is alternating, so they go from one to the other. And the advantage of that is that we get that nice chaotic feel that you get from the Swiss Guard. Obviously the Swiss Guard, as I said, have a red undersuit with the yellows and blues kind of over the top. And the only way to recreate that if we wanted to go identical would be to essentially pinstripe the model, which I don't want to do, but I still want that clashing bright colour feeling. And I think this is a nice way to achieve that, just by layering them next to each other and alternating as we go across the model. Now, don't worry, we are going to be touching on the Swiss Guard a little bit more in the future and going into some more details. But for a fun fact for now, before we carry on, did you know that the Pope isn't actually a title? It's more of an informal name that's been adopted and colloquially used for understanding who he is. But to my understanding, and feel free to check and clarify this and correct me if I'm wrong, the Pope isn't actually a title that the Pope has. So the Pope isn't the Pope. He does have many other titles. He's got titles which are really interesting and long and very much feel like they are suitable for 40k, but that's another thing. His titles do include the successor of the Prince of the Apostles, the Archbishop and Metropolitan of the Roman Province, and the Supreme Pontiff of the Universal Church. And with that all said, let's jump back into the painting. Jumping back across to the blues, we can finish them off now with a relatively thin but not edge highlight of a pure coat of ultramarines blue. This will follow up on the last rounds, giving us a nice rich bright blue edge, but giving us room for a final edge highlight, which we'll be coming back to do later on. With this done, we can turn across to the other colour in our split scheme, which is naturally the red. Similar to the blues, we are going to be building this up over a few mixes. First, we're going to mix some cadmium-free cadmium red into our purple, and then this will give us a nice burgundy tone. This can be applied as essentially the second base coat, where all of the panels will be hit, leaving the purple in the recesses. Covering most of the elements here, we can add a little bit more red and then do the broad highlight, which is going to be hitting the majority of areas, giving the overall mid-tone a nice hue that is clearly red. Don't worry, we're not finished with the reds yet. We will be coming back and touching them off, but I just wanted to kind of highlight the methodology that we're using that you probably noticed as we've painted the models. And that is that we're using a fair few layers, and we're doing them quickly so that we can relatively pump the models out, especially since it's a split scheme and we've got to do a lot of balancing. But by using multiple layers, we can build up a nice simple transition from any color we really want to the other. And I always try and break these down into 4 or 5 layers if I can do. And that has multiple advantages. So if we just quickly look at this, going from a dark purple to a bright purple in one jump is really noticeable. Now, if we're going to be keeping the edges and areas the same and we just add in a single mid-tone, you may notice that the transition from one color to the other is now not as harsh. So going again and adding in another 2 layers, we have a much smoother movement from one color to another. And as I said, I do like this benefit of being able to blend between them through layers. And that's one of the reasons I actually suggest kind of mixing paints if you're not comfortable with it, at least trying it. Because rather than needing a bunch of different colors, I can simply grab 2 colors, for example, a shadow or a highlight or a red and a blue, whatever I want to do, and then blend them between each other by making up multiple mixes. Yes, you run the risk of if you're batch painting, your mixes may not be the same on future batches, but overall you can kind of get around with that because they're not on massive areas that everyone's going to be noticing, and you can compare them to your old models if you need to. So with that all said, I do just wanted to kind of point out that that's how we're approaching this, so you will see that as we finish off the armor. By now, our broad highlight should hopefully be dry on the model, and we can start to mix yet more red into our previous mix, and this will give us an almost pure red but not quite red mix. This will be used as a narrow highlight pass. Similar to the pre-blue highlight stage earlier, what we want to do is catch any of the edges and flat panels in direct light, leaving room for future edge highlights in a brighter color. Now, it's not going to be long until we actually go in with our red and do our final edge highlight. We're going to be doing it in a moment. However, before we start doing that, what I would suggest is grabbing our ultramarine blue as well as a relatively light blue. And we're going to be mixing these together to make our edge highlight blue color. And I suggest doing these both at the same time. And the reason for this is where part of the edges we're going to be highlighting is the connection where they meet potentially. It's good to have the red and the blue together because if we happen to go a little bit off course as we're highlighting, we can always come in and correct that with the blue highlight or the red highlight, depending how we're painting and what area we're painting at the time. So just make those mixes up at the same time. If you're using a wet palette, it makes it a lot easier because they're going to be fresher and usable for longer. And then we can jump into the highlighting. Starting off with the brighter blue mix, we can go around and edge highlight all of the panels that we want blue across the model. This will naturally be on all of the upward facing areas. We'll get a slightly broader highlight, while we're going to be going in with thinner, more directed edge highlights on any areas of recess. Once the blues are all down, we can do the same with the pure red, and then use this pure red to pick out any of the edges on the red armor sections that we need to brighten up. It's worth bearing in mind that any highlights that we place on, for example, the blues, we are going to want to make sure we continue that pattern across into the section of red, so the light is consistent across the whole model and set areas. This is going to nicely wrap up the main bulk of the armor plates, as well as any other areas that we may have wanted to paint blue or red. So we can turn to our last bulk main color, which will be yellow. And for this, we're going to want to start off by grabbing a light pink, using this to base coat any of the areas that we want to be yellow in the future, as well as taking the opportunity to base any elements that we want to read as skin. Once the pink is down and dry, we can push the brightness and lightness a little bit by grabbing a very pale light flesh, using this to highlight all of the areas that we painted pink, giving us a nice quick transition to almost a white tone. This can then be covered in a nice thick bright coat of a yellow contrast, which will give us a nice bright yellow with warm shadowed recesses from that pink base coat that we applied. With the first layer of yellow down and applied, naturally it's contrast, so it's going to take a little bit of time to dry if we're not bulk painting multiple models. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about the theory of color ratios in a scheme. Talking about highlights mainly, let's bring back the diagram from earlier, but we're going to swap some of the colours out. Now we have a transition from one colour to another, which should hopefully show this off a little bit more. In this scheme, we are painting from shadow to highlight and using around 5 stages to get there from the base coat up to that highlight. Now here we can really go from any shadow to any highlight we want. And overall, the bit that kind of matters for the model painting side is this middle range, or what we call the mid-tone. If we make these sections of mid-tone too small overall, the model will read more as colours in other areas. So we want to nicely straddle the right ratios to give us a smooth transition, but still making sure that our colours read as the correct colour choice that we want it to, by making sure a broad amount is within that mid-tone. These ratios are some of the reasons why you may find that when you're painting certain colours and you're, say, highlighting a red with an orange, if you end up painting too much of the surface area in the orange highlight, doing potentially too strong or too many edge highlights, the model itself can read as kind of a dark orange as opposed to a bright red. So it's worth bearing in mind and just making sure that you know what your mid-tone is while you're applying it on the model. It kind of works the same overall with the scheme that we're doing here in the sense of the overall look of the model. We're balancing the amount and the quantities of colours versus the brightness as well. So for example, the yellow is going to stand out quite a lot here, even though it's on smaller sections, because it is overall kind of brighter than the subdued but still bright elements of the armour. Speaking of yellows, now the contrast is dry, let's get a bright yellow, mix it into our contrast and get to work. These two yellows should mix nicely to give us a nice dilute but yet bright yellow, which we can take and then go round and highlight all of the past work. What we'll see is, thanks to going over with a contrast over our pink and flesh, we should have some nice brighter areas marked out by the contrast. This will give us a clean area that we can go around and highlight with this yellow, giving us that bright punch of yellow on the edges. This leaves a few bits left. Mainly we've got all of the belt items, along with things like the weapons and the filigree. These can all be kicked off in a very similar way, with a simple application of a dark brown contrast. This will give us a nice base coat to work from with future steps. Naturally, all of these elements can be painted however you want. Things like weapons, pouches, you may have a preferred way of doing it, or you might just want to slap contrast on the pouches and leave them alone if they're covered by a gun. However, we're going to be tackling a method that I think is suitable for the army that we're doing, inspired by the Swiss Guard. Talking of the Swiss Guard, let's jump into some fun facts. Did you know that the Swiss Guard is not only the oldest continuous service army, but it is also one of the smallest, or in fact the smallest, with around 130 to 140 holy warriors. These are mercenaries initially that came from Switzerland and all of that area. Not quite sure of the geology at the time, and they came across because of economic turmoil in their own country and turned out to be very good mercenaries, were hired on and then formalized in the early 1500s. There's a lot more to the story that I can't really go onto in a small section in this video, but it is quite interesting that that's how it initially formed. Now you'll generally find them in Vatican City, doing things like tours, helping tourists, as well as being general security, which is why I liked the idea of using them for the Vigilant Squad. Jumping back to our remaining items, we can deal with all of the browns and leathers. So here we're looking at things like the belt, the pouches, and the scrolls. And these will all get a nice application of a mid-brown. These can all be picked out in various different highlighting methods, depending on the elements and the placements, and however you prefer to paint. We can go from simple line edge highlighting on all of the leathers, to more of a scratchy textured highlight across the various surfaces. With this done, we can tackle the metals, and these are going to be done in two styles. First, we want to take a gold and use this to highlight some of the elements across the model. Here we're targeting things like the filigrees, the badges, the buckles, as well as the framing surround of the gun. While the other areas are going to get a relatively heavy overbrush or pure layer coat of a mid-silver. This will help to add some tonal difference, because once everything is dry and all of the silvers and browns and everything we've done is sorted, we can cover all of those metals and browns in a nice sepia wash. This will help also to pick out all of the sculpted details across the model, so that we get a nice effect from anything that we've painted in this metallic. Beyond this, there's only really a couple of other elements. We've got things like the lights, the buttons, and bits like that across the model. And essentially we just kind of cheated, picked the only other really bright color that we had, which was a green and wasn't already on the model, and then just put dots of these across where any of those lights, things like that were. We didn't do anything fancy like OSL, just a quick one layer of a green, just so that it is a painted area. Now, this is how they come out, and I really do like how they came out. I appreciate it's not a complete replica of the Swiss Guard. Naturally, the Swiss Guard have a red undersuit with the blue and the yellow striping over the top, whereas we've gone for kind of an inverse. They also have gold armor, which is, I believe, passed down from soldier to soldier and repaired over time. But what we do also have here is a similar effect. We've got a yellow undersuit. The armor panels are painted in the other colors of the Swiss Guard. And then we've gone for the golden antique-y looking armor on the weapons and some of the other elements. And as I said, I really like it. I think this might possibly be a good representation of what development happens and basically taking the current Swiss Guard ceremonial scheme and chucking it 30,000 years into the future, where it's more now of a geometrical, tactical camo pattern, but keeping the lore and history if it was the case. Now, with all that said, we didn't do any major conversions here. We didn't go around, carve any heads, amend any guns or anything like that. But that's not always the case. In this video, which I suggest you check out, we took a Cadian combat patrol and we changed it to what is one of my favorite projects so far, the Canadian combat patrol. So why not check that video out here? Otherwise, do remember to subscribe so that we can see you next time.